Hello, friends, and welcome to Sleep Tight Stories. Solomon has finished trying to settle other people's problems after having trouble with Jasper Jay and Mr. Crow. Simon, his smaller cousin, and Solomon both love to eat. When they decide to go hunting together, things don't work out quite as Solomon hoped, so they try to come to some sort of an agreement. But in the end, Simon does not get the best part of the deal. The Tale of Solomon Owl, Part 6. Solomon Owl had a small cousin named Simon Screecher. He was unlike Solomon in some respects because he always wore ear tufts, and his eyes were yellow instead of black. But in some other ways, he was no different from Solomon Owl, for he was a noisy chap and dearly loved mice to eat. It happened that the two met in the woods one fine fall evening, and they agreed to go hunting mice together. Now, being so much smaller than Solomon, Simon Screecher was all the sprier. In fact, he was so active that he could catch mice faster than Solomon Owl could capture them. And they had not hunted long before Solomon discovered that Simon had succeeded in disposing of 6 mice to his 3. That discovery did not please Solomon at all. "Look here," he said, "since we are hunting together, it's only fair to divide what we catch half and half." Simon Screecher hesitated. But after reflecting that his cousin was very big and very strong, he agreed to Solomon's suggestion. So they resumed their hunting, and every time one of them caught 2 mice, he gave 1 mouse to his cousin. Still, Solomon Owl was not satisfied. "Wait a moment," Solomon called to Simon Screecher. "It has just occurred to me that I am more than twice as big as you are, so I ought to have twice as many mice as you." This time, Simon Screecher hesitated longer. He did not like the second suggestion any more than he did the first, and in the end, he said as much too. But Solomon Owl insisted that it was only fair. "You surely ought to be glad to please your own cousin," he told Simon. "It's not that," said Simon Screecher. "It seems to me that since I am not half your size, I ought to have twice as many mice to eat, so I'll grow bigger." Well, Solomon Owl hadn't thought of that. He was puzzled to know what to say, and he wanted time to think. "I'll think over what you say," he told Simon Screecher. "And now, since it's almost dawn, we'd better not hunt any longer tonight. But I'll meet you again at dusk if you come to my house." "Very well, Cousin Solomon," Simon answered. "I'm sure that after you've had a good sleep, you will be ready to agree with me." "If that's the case, I may not take any nap at all," Solomon replied. "Oh, you ought to have your rest," his cousin exclaimed. Simon knew that if Solomon went all day without sleep, he would be very irritable by nightfall. "Well, I'll try to get 40 winks," Solomon promised, "but I don't believe I can get more than that, because I have so much on my mind that I'm sure to be restless." Simon Screecher was somewhat worried as they parted. His wailing, tremulous whistle, which floated through the shadowy woods, showed that he was far from happy. It proved to be just as Solomon Owl had told his cousin Simon Screecher. Solomon had so much on his mind that he had no sooner fallen asleep than he awoke again to study over the question that perplexed him. He certainly did not want Simon to have twice as many mice as he did, but Simon's argument was a good one. He had said that since Solomon was more than twice his size, it was only fair that he should have a chance to grow. And everyone knew, Solomon reflected, everybody knew that eating made one larger. The longer Solomon thought, the farther he seemed from any answer that he liked, and he had begun to fear that he would not succeed in getting more than 39 winks all day, instead of 40, when all at once an idea came into his mind. Solomon knew right away that he had nothing more to worry about. He dropped into a sound sleep with a pleasant smile upon his usually serious face. And when he opened his eyes again, it was time for Simon Screecher to arrive. Yes, Solomon could hear his cousin's whistle even then, so he hurried to his door, and there was Simon, sitting on a limb of the big hemlock waiting for him. "It's all right," said Solomon to his cousin. "I agree to your suggestion. We'll hunt together again tonight, and if you will give me 1/3 of all the mice you catch, I promise to give you 2/3 of all the mice I catch." "Good," said Simon Screecher, and he looked vastly relieved. "Just hoot when you have any mice for me." "Whistle when you have any for me," Solomon Owl replied. And at that, they started out for their night's sport. It was not long before Simon Screecher's well-known whistle brought Solomon hurrying to him. Simon already had 3 mice, one of which he gave to Solomon, according to their agreement. The same thing happened several times, until at last Simon Screecher began to grumble. "What's the matter?" he asked his cousin. "You are not hooting as you promised you would." "But I haven't caught any mice," Solomon Owl replied. Again and again and again, Simon's call summoned Solomon. But not once did Solomon's call Simon. And all the time Simon Screecher grew more discontented. Toward the end of the night, he declared flatly that he wasn't going to hunt any more with his cousin. "I've done exactly as I agreed," Solomon Owl protested. "You're altogether too slow and clumsy," Simon Screecher told him bluntly. "If I'm going to hunt with anybody after this, I'm going to choose someone that's as spry as me. There's no sense in my working for you. Here I've worked hard all night long and I'm still hungry, for I've given you 1/3 of my food." They parted then, and none too pleasantly. In Simon's whistle as he flew away toward his home, there was unmistakable anger. But Solomon Owl's answering hoots, while they were not exactly sweet, seemed to carry more than a hint of laughter. One would naturally think that Solomon might have been even hungrier than his small cousin, but it was not so. He had had more to eat than usual, for he had been very busy catching locusts and katydids, and frogs too. Solomon Owl had not tried to catch a single mouse that night. You know now the idea that had come to him while he was lying awake in his house during the daytime. He had made up his mind that he would not hunt for mice, and since he had not promised Simon to give him anything else, there was no reason why he should not eat all the frogs and katydids and locusts he could find. Perhaps it was not surprising that Simon Screecher never guessed the truth. But he seemed to know that there was something strange about that night's hunting, for he never came to Solomon Owl's house again. It was winter, and for several days a strong south wind had swept up Pleasant Valley. That, as Solomon Owl knew very well, meant a thaw was coming. He was not sorry, because the weather had been bitterly cold. Well, the thaw came, and the weather grew so warm that Solomon Owl could stay out all night without once feeling chilled. He found the change so agreeable that he strayed farther from home than was his custom. Indeed, he was far away on the other side of Blue Mountain at midnight when it began to rain. Now, that was not quite so pleasant, but still Solomon Owl did not mind too much. It was not until later that he began to feel alarmed, when he noticed that flying did not seem as easy as usual. Solomon had grown heavy all at once, and goodness knows it was not because he had overeaten, for food was scarce at that season of the year. Moreover, Solomon's wings were strangely stiff. When he moved them, they cracked. "It must be my joints," he said to himself. "I'm afraid this wetting has given me rheumatism." So he started home at once, though it was only midnight. But the further he went, the worse he felt, and the harder it was to fly. "I'll have to rest for a while," he said to himself at last. So he landed on a limb, for he was more tired than he had ever been in all his life. But he soon felt so much better that he was ready to start on again. And then, to his dismay, Solomon Owl found that he could hardly stir. The moment he left his perch, he floundered down upon the ground, and though he tried his hardest, he couldn't reach the tree again. The rain was still beating down steadily, and Solomon began to think it was a bad night to be out. What was worse, the weather was quickly turning cold. "I'm afraid I'll have to stay in bed a week after this," he groaned. "If I sit here very long as wet as I am, while the thaw turns into a freeze, I will certainly be ill." Now, if it hadn't been for the rain, Solomon Owl would have had no trouble at all. Or if it hadn't been for the freezing cold, he would have been in no difficulty. Though he didn't know it, his trouble was simply this: the rain froze upon him as fast as it fell, covering him with a coating of ice. It was no wonder that he felt strangely heavy. No wonder that he couldn't fly. There he crouched on the ground while the rain and sleet beat upon him. And the only comforting thought that entered his head was that on so stormy a night, Tommy Fox and Fatty Raccoon would be snug and warm in their beds. They wouldn't go out in such weather. And Solomon Owl wished that he too had stayed at home that night. From midnight until almost dawn, Solomon Owl sat there. Now and then he tried to fly, but it was no use. He could scarcely raise himself off the ground. At last, he decided he would have to walk home. Fortunately, a hard crust covered the soft snow, so Solomon started off on his long journey. Flying, Solomon could have covered the distance in a few minutes, but he was a slow walker. By the time he reached his home among the hemlocks, the sun was shining brightly, for the rain had stopped before daybreak. Solomon wondered how he would ever succeed in reaching his doorway, high up in the hollow tree. He gazed helplessly upward, and as he sat there sadly, the bright sunshine melted the ice that covered his wings. After a time, he discovered that he could move freely once more, and then he rose quickly in the air, and in a twinkling, he had disappeared into the darkness of his home. That darkness which to him was always so pleasant. And that is the end of this part. Good night. Sleep tight.